It seems like an obvious question. What is a game? But when you think about all the things that we refer to when we say games, it's not really a simple one at all. Are we talking about board games, or tabletop RPGs, perhaps video games or card games, or sports? There's really not much in common in terms of gameplay between, say, Pokemon or football, for example. But they're still both unequivocally games. Why?
What makes games games isn't the fact that they have gameplay in common. Rather, it's that they're interactive, and that they all abide by a set of rules.
Is this really how we're doing this?
Do you have any other ideas?
Guess not. But back to your point. An ATM is interactive, and it also abides by a set of rules. You have to put in a password in order to get the last $200 out of your bank account. So does that make ATMs games? I mean, obviously not. So your definition is good, it's just not quite narrow enough. Authors Katie Salen and Eric Zimmerman make this distinction in Rules of Play, Game Design Fundamentals, that games have a quantifiable goal or outcome. At the conclusion of a game, a player either won or lost, or received some kind of numerical score. A quantifiable outcome is usually what distinguishes a game from less formal play activities. So it isn't enough for games to be interactive and have rules of play, they also have to tell us how well we are at playing them. In fact, it is the ranking and the winning that makes a simulated world and its rules self-evidently a game.
What do you mean by self-evident?
Well, for example, let's take a look at the all-time classic, Pong. The rules of Pong define a bouncing ball and 2 interactive paddles, meeting the standard of your definition. But there's one more crucial piece that makes Pong a game. When one player fails to deflect the ball, their opponent gets a point, and after earning 11 points, we can say definitively who played best. Now, pretend for a moment that you've never played Pong or any game like it. You walk up to a Pong arcade with a friend, and everything is in place as described, except for one thing: the score. You and your opponent can move your paddles, bounce the ball off screen, and it'll reset itself. But what exactly is the point of this interactive simulation? Is it to keep the ball from bouncing between paddles for as long as you can? Or perhaps you're meant to keep the paddles synchronized and avoid the ball altogether? Or maybe even you're supposed to move the paddle as many times up and down the screen before the ball goes out of view. I mean, all these interpretations are valid and arbitrary. Without the simulation explicitly conveying what kinds of strategy it rewards, you can't know how it wants you to play, and that's why any form of play without a win condition isn't considered a game.
But that excludes a lot of interactive experiences that we call games. Are you saying The Sims or the Stanley Parable aren't games at all?
Well, yes. And it's not just those experiences that you mentioned. Most single-player video games are not games at all. Games like BioShock or Tomb Raider or Arkham Knight, they're not games because you can't win them. You can only complete them. And not finishing a story is no more losing than it is winning.
Some of those games tally how much of their content you've played through. Is that not a score? How doesn't that qualify?
Well, think of it this way. Let's say I finish the main quest of Skyrim, but I don't complete any of the side content. Do I lose Skyrim? Do I have to pick every permutation of dialogue option and see every piece of side content in order for me to win Skyrim? I mean, we don't even say I won Skyrim, we say I beat Skyrim because I finished its story. It's for the exact same reason Bandersnatch on Netflix or a Choose Your Own Adventure book is also not a game, because even though your choices can result in better or worse outcomes, there's no strategy on which to judge. It's just different routes to completion.
Isn't that overly narrow, or how dare gatekeeping of you?
No, because I'm not actually putting those experiences beneath games in terms of importance or merit. In fact, I'd say that they're greater than games, something more encompassing than games could ever be. They're complex, multifaceted forms of interactive art. Game studies researcher Espen Aarseth puts it like this. He says,
"Games are not simply games, but
complex software programs that can emulate any medium, including film, text/novel, graphic novel, and, for that matter, simulate board games and sports. We often commit the mistake of using the metonymic term games for software that in reality are integrated cross-media packages.
What?
Yeah, metonymic. It's basically like using an attribute of something as a slang term for that thing, like calling business people suits or referring to an exquisitely prepared meal as a dish. And in similar fashion, we call playable entertainment games because while they're not games, they are game-like and they often contain games within them.
How is Arkham Knight not a game, but also contain games within it? Are you not just being overly pedantic?
Well, Arkham Knight's a great example of this, actually. Arkham Knight's rhythmic, frenetic combat is composed of attacks, counters, and dodges, which are all quantified by its combo system. The game recognizes and rewards accurate timing, as well as using a variety of Batman's gadgets. And at the end of an encounter, the game scores your effort, showing how skillful your strategy was. And if you weren't so skillful, your failure results in a sarcastic rebuke and a reset, allowing you to try a different strategy. It's in that opportunity for success and failure, supplemented by the ranking score, that defines Arkham Knight's combat as a self-contained game. Other forms of play within Knight aren't games, such as speeding through the streets in the Batmobile, or zipping from building to building with the Bat Grapple. There is no quantitative measure for how well you grapple through Gotham City. It's simply transportation, a form of digital play. But back to Aarseth's definition. He says that games are these hybrid media packages of interactive and non-interactive elements. And in my opinion, we only need to look away from our screens and to the real world to see these creations for what they really are.
And what is that, exactly?
Theater.
Theater.
Indeed. A play is a live performance set in a fabricated world, performed by actors for an audience. The world of the play is comprised of sets, costumes, props, lighting, visual effects, sound, and music. While the narrative usually remains the same, the delivery of the performance changes with the mood and impulsivity of the actor performing it. A simulated play, simul-play, if you will, is a live performance that's set in a simulated world performed by the player for the player. The world of the simulated play is comprised of sets, costumes, props, lighting, visual effects, sound, and music.
This was a triumph.
And while the narrative usually remains the same, the delivery of the action changes with the mood and impulsivity of the player performing it.
You can't be serious. I can run around in a game and do whatever I want. I can play the same game 20 times in an infinite number of ways. Theater is highly scripted, rehearsed. It's the same, performance after performance.
Well, certainly most theater is like that, but aren't video game cutscenes similarly linear? Even the ones with dialogue options, those have been rehearsed and recorded and animated. You'd be wrong to assume that theater doesn't have its moments of unscripted or dynamic performance. Clue the Musical, for example, has over 216 different endings depending on the audience choice. The play Completeness has a totally unscripted scene in the duration of the show. You don't have to look very far into comedy improvisation, the avant-garde, or performance art spaces to find totally unscripted performance in live theater. So, I guess my point is that the only difference between live theater and a simul play like Resident Evil 4 is that in Resident Evil 4, the actor and the audience are the same person.
But how am I acting in a video game? I'm not moving my body or saying any lines.
But you don't have a body.
Rude. And beside the point, we use controllers to play video games. How exactly is that acting?
Well, VR is certainly changing that. And also, don't discount that most marionette puppeteers typically only use their hands when they're conducting their performances. How is that any different from using a controller?
Well,
in the world of puppetry, it's actually not uncommon to have an actor voice a character while other actors are performing its physical motions. And you're really not doing that much different in a simul play like Uncharted. You're actually performing the physical choreography of Nathan Drake, while Nolan North is emoting his lines.
Alright, let's say I buy that for games with a story. But What about games with no overt narrative, like Minecraft or Planet Coaster?
Well, and that's a good question. In fact, Game Discourse has actually covered those at length. It's in the very name of their genre. They're sandboxes. And sandboxes aren't games, per se. They're more of a set of creative tools that allow for user expression or user-generated storytelling. But they can contain games, and when they do, those modes constrain those tools in novel or challenging ways, by adding things like time limits or only allowing you a new set of tools after you've successfully accomplished a goal. And I'd like to point out that sandboxes can actually contain simuplays as well, and it's for that reason that they are the broadest and most encompassing form of interactive entertainment.
So you think it goes games, which are challenges set in a simulated world that judge you based on your strategy, then simuplays, which are just interactive theater that can also contain games, and then finally sandboxes, which are just creative tools that can both encompass games and simuplays. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, and of course there are exceptions where these three blur into each other, but I do think it's a good place to start. And I'd like to point out that simulations need not be digital. We can simulate worlds in our heads or with physical props. I guess if there's one takeaway from this discussion, it's that games are their own specific thing, and that their definition is rather exclusive. Simuplays and sandboxes may use similar methods to entertain us, but, like I've said before, they aren't games.
And you think we should refer to them accordingly? Gone are the days where we call all three of them games?
No, I don't think we should stop referring to all three of them as games. I would like to see more specific vocabulary for each kind of interactive entertainment, but it's kind of hard because, all the good terms have already been taken by other media. I came up with simuplay, which is kind of clunky, and when you think about a sandbox, it literally has nothing to do with what it refers to. It's neither sand nor a box.
Well, not every name has to be literal, but I take your point. Now, simuplay, you might want to workshop a little bit more.
But terminology aside, it's more important that we understand what defines a game, or a simuplay, or a sandbox. It's in understanding their boundaries that makes each of them more easily studied and critiqued, and therefore created.
Well, this all has been very nerdy and academic, but cool.
Well, this is just the beginning. The game multiverse is massive and ripe for study. And any observation of it is as only good as it holds up to scrutiny. So, perhaps you've come to different conclusions than I have. Maybe you have a more concise definition of what games are, or how to define other forms of interactive entertainment. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to see any other game-related topic discussed on this channel, feel free to put those there too. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And until next time, happy gaming!